Good evening, class. I'm actually sitting here at night recording this for you. Hopefully you'll be seeing this tomorrow, which will be Wednesday the 12th. After you view this last half of America's involvement in World War I, please, sometime between tomorrow and the next class that we meet, which is not next Monday, but the Monday after next, get online and look for a lecture titled The Interwar Period. That lecture will entail talking about at least the 1920s in the United States. I may leave the 1930s for class, but you'll need to watch that YouTube video about the 1920s to be up to speed for our discussion in class. This lecture, of course, will be titled World War Part 2. Let's get into it real quick. Now, last class period we talked about the origins of the war, how Western society, not just American society, was optimistic based on technology and science, and how it seemed that Western culture would be the dominant culture, a good culture, a great place to live, if you will, for the foreseeable future. However, we talked about how underneath the surface you have these nasty undercurrents of perverted nationalism, colonial disputes, an arms race between Germany and Great Britain. You have the alliance system that was born out of these tensions. And of course, we talked about the war plans and how these detailed timetables basically created military machines that once the trigger of war was thrown, it would be very hard to stop these offensive actions. And we talked about the trigger for the war, the assassination of Francis Ferdinand of Austria. We also talked about the race to the sea and how this, of course, culminated in the shell crisis, and why fighting on the Western Front here, if you can view this, why this degenerated into the trench war that characterized much of World War I. And that was because the planners for World War I, the Schlieffen Plan, Plan 17, the British planners, the Russian planners, all these military planners had planned to fight the Napoleonic Wars all over again, a war of movement, of cavalry, of saber charges, and of black powder muskets reminiscent of the American Civil War. Instead, they were fighting a war with heavy artillery, machine guns, bolt-action rifles, and, as we're going to talk about later on, aircraft and tanks. Now, near the end of last lecture, we were talking about America in the war, because America didn't immediately get into the war. We talked about how most Americans were pacifistic. We'll revisit this later on in this lecture as well. But how America, in terms of economic ties, especially things like bank loans, credit, economic engagement, economic connections in the form of munitions contracts, all of these were being made during World War I, but mainly to one side, the British and the French. American banks and American businessmen are going to have a vested interest in the positive outcome of the British and French winning. Now, what is going on while the United States watches? Well, let's talk about the battles. And 1916 is a year of battles. Now, I'm not trying to take away from the battles that were fought early in late 1914. 1915, you had some major battles on the Western Front. But the classic battles that Americans in the World War I era were sitting back and watching mainly occurred in 1916. It's the battles that happened in 1916 that we remember from that war. So let's talk about these battles, and hopefully you guys can get kind of in the head of Americans as they're hearing about these battles. Now, one of the first of these battles that we're going to talk about is the Battle of Verdun. Now, up until 1916, up until February of 1916, the aim of both sides, the Allies, which are the French and the British, and the Germans is to break the Allied lines so that the war can become a war of maneuver. Because by 1916, it's a static war. It's a trench war. It's a war that isn't moving. And up until 1916, the whole goal was to get it back into a fluid war. Hopefully a war that will end quickly. Now, in February of 1916, the Germans have sort of a shake-up at what is known as the German General Staff, the High Command, if you will. A fellow by the name of Erich von Falkenhayn, Falkenhyn, is elevated to the head of the German General Staff. Now, the General Staff are the generals who make the overall plans for the war, and Falkenhayn has a different take on this. Instead of trying to break through the French or the British lines, he transforms German strategy from a war of maneuver to a war of attrition. He wants to bleed the Allies. He wants to bleed them white. Now, what is a war of attrition? A war of attrition is where the aim of your army is not to defeat the enemy on the battlefield and gain territory. Instead, it is to kill more of the enemy than they kill of you, to make it so costly for your enemy they will sue for peace. That is what Falkenhayn initiates in February of 1916. His plan is simple. He is going to choose a bulge. There are several bulges in the line. They're often called salients. Now, one of the bulges is an important bulge for the French. It's here, at Verdun. Now, Verdun is the ancestral home of the French kings. Verdun is a historic place that the French are going to defend in World War I at all costs. And Falkenhayn knows this. So, in February of 1916, actually February 21st, 1916, Falkenhayn initiates a battle plan aimed at simulating the attack on Verdun, trying to take Verdun, but not really trying to take Verdun. The hope is to get the French not to retreat under overwhelming odds, but instead to force them to push as many men into this salient right here as possible. Verdun is supplied by one single road, and the hope is not to cut that road, but to keep the road open. This is the German plan. To keep the road open, but at the same time to threaten Verdun to such a degree that the French feel compelled that they have to keep feeding men and materiel into this meat grinder. And so they kick this thing off on February 21st, 1916, with an over 12-hour artillery bombardment. Now, Verdun is made up of several key forts, and many of them are just absolutely destroyed. They're turned into rubble. They're turned into gravel. And over the course of this battle, the French and the Germans will commit hundreds of thousands of troops. Both sides will commit almost 1 million men each. Now, on many occasions, the Germans could seize the road that runs right back through here. And of course, the Americans are not here at this time, so don't get confused with them being here. But they don't. They purposely, the Germans purposely do not try and isolate Verdun. They want to have the Germans continually feed troops in. And so this battle lasts from the end of February until December 19th, 1916. So 11 months. This thing will last 11 months. The front line does not change. And Falkenhayn gets half of what he wants, because he does make it incredibly costly for the French, because they lose about 250 to 300,000 men. Actually, about 300, actually more like 300 to 350,000 men, because both sides suffer almost equally. An estimated 700,000 French and German soldiers die during this battle. die, or I should say this, the casualty figures are 700 killed or wounded. Now this is a battle in which there are actually probably more killed than wounded. There are still remains of soldiers being dug up by the French farmers around Verdun, even today. As we're going to talk about at the end of this lecture, World War I is incredibly costly. And this is one of those costly battles. Now, while the Germans are trying to bleed the French white, the British have been trying to starve the Germans out. If you look very closely, this is a map of Europe. And if I can go back here, this is a map, oops, there we go, of this area right here. This is a battle map of this area right here. So the northern coast of the Low Countries, Germany, right here, Great Britain, and the North Sea. Ever since the outbreak of war in August of 1914, the British Royal Navy have used what has come to be called at this time the Grand Fleet to blockade Europe right here and right here. Germany needs imports. They need imports of raw materials, and they need imports of food, because their farmers can't produce all the food that they need because their farmers are being drafted to fight in the military. It's not that Germany doesn't have farmland, it's just they're running out of farmers. Even before the war, during times of peace, a good percentage of the food that Germans eat is imported. Ironically enough, it's imported from us, the United States. However, this food is not getting through because the British are blocking all ships sailing to the continent through through the North Sea right here, or through the Channel ports right here. They're basically walling off Europe with naval power. Now, by 1916, the Germans are starting to feel the pinch. They're starting to feel the pressure of this blockade. And so the German Navy will attempt they'll try an interesting strategy to try and break this blockade. The head of the German Navy, a fellow by the name of Scheer, S-C-H-E-E-R, Scheer comes up with a very interesting and probably would have worked battle plan. Scheer's plan is simple. He's going to send out a small part of his navy, the High Seas Fleet, to try and lure in a small part of the British fleet, a part of this blockading force. However, following behind the decoy force of the Germans would be the entire German High Seas Fleet. So you have what are known as battle cruisers, which are lightly armored but heavily armed ships that are going to be the decoys. And they're going to try and pull in part of the British Grand Fleet. Hopefully, the British fleet will fall into this trap where they're going to be outnumbered by the Germans. That little small piece will be outnumbered by the Germans because the Germans do not have the ships needed to take on the entire British Grand Fleet. The entire British Grand Fleet outnumbers the German fleet almost 2-1. Now, the reason why this plan is a failure from the start is because, to put it bluntly, the British are reading the Germans' mail. The Germans send their orders from Berlin to their major ports of Wilhelmshaven and Kiel via radio. The British over here have broken the encryption code. They are able to decipher the orders, and they know exactly what the Germans are planning. So they set their own trap. They'll send out a small section of their fleet in order to engage the decoy force of the Germans. But their small fleet is itself a decoy to bring in the rest of the German High Seas Fleet. Behind the British decoy force will be the entire British Grand Fleet. So this plan by the Germans is initiated on late May of 1916. The battle occurs between May 31st and June 1st of 1916. So over these 2 days and 2 nights, these 2 massive battle fleets that helped cause World War I, that cost millions of pounds and millions of marks to build, enormous amount of material, raw material, steel and copper and other materials. All of the expertise that went into building them. This is the climactic battle that many thought would occur because of the arms race. Now, despite the fact that a lot of Germans and a lot of British sailors die in this battle, the British lose, I believe, 4 or 5 capital ships on top of smaller vessels like destroyers. The Germans don't lose as many vessels. I think they lose 2 vessels and have several severely damaged. So from a tactical standpoint, the Germans survive. The British fail in annihilating the German high seas fleet. But from a strategic standpoint, the Germans fail because they do not accomplish their mission of breaking this all-important blockade. More importantly, the end of the battle is very anticlimactic. Instead of one side fighting to the end, the Germans, realizing that they're completely outnumbered, that they're facing the entire British Grand Fleet, they turn around and sail back to the protection of these minefields. There, these ships will go into port, and from 1916 until 1918, except for a very few small exceptions of maybe a destroyer or cruiser going out to patrol the coastline right here, the German high seas fleet, this fleet that they built at high expense, not only material and economically, but also politically, would never sail again. It would sit in, these ships would sit in harbor, their sailors sitting idle. And this is important because idle hands, well, idle hands are the devil's instruments, as the old saying goes. These idle German sailors will become radicalized, as we will talk about in the next lecture. Now, there's another battle that sort of defines World War I, and this is the Battle of the Somme. Now, if we scroll down here to, let's see here, back to our map, the Somme is right up here. The Somme River runs right through here. Now, the battle area is right in here, right at where the French and British forces meet up. So this battle is going to entail mainly British soldiers, but also French soldiers as well. Now, the British come up with a plan. While the Germans seem to be so preoccupied with the battle here at Verdun, they hope, these are the British military commanders, the British military commanders hope that the lines here would be weakened, that they had to get their soldiers from somewhere to fight at Verdun, so they must have scavenged soldiers here along the River Somme. So the British planned to have their own assault. Now, the British plan is simple. It's not going to be a battle of attrition. They're going to try and break through the lines here at the Somme. Break through so that they can get here, get my pointer to work here, behind the German lines, because see, if they can penetrate right through here, they can roll up the British lines and start heading for the German border again. That's the plan. Well, like many plans in World War I, it doesn't work. Because on July 1st, when this battle kicks off and the men go over the top, that phrase, going over the top, comes from World War I, as men would get out of the trenches and go over the lip of the trench. When the British soldiers get up and go over the top, well, those first soldiers going into no man's land are met with artillery fire and machine guns. The British soldiers had hoped that the British barrage that had opened before their soldiers went out of the trenches had either killed, wounded, or confused the Germans. More importantly, they hoped that their artillery would have destroyed the barbed wire entanglements in front of their trenches. However, the British artillery shells didn't touch the barbed wire, and the Germans Well, they'd learned from their experience in World War I, and they had built dugouts and bunkers in their trench system so that when artillery started to fall, their troops went like rats underground and were pretty much immune from it all. So when the British approached the German front lines, the barbed wire is still there. These troops who are heavily laden with supplies and ammunition, they can't make it through quickly. And the Germans are, well, they're back in force. And so the British are mowed down. In the first day alone, the casualty rate of killed, wounded, or missing for the British alone, so one day, was 60,000. 60,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. To put this in perspective, in the time period between 1964 and 1974, so 10 years, the United States would lose 55,000 killed in action in Vietnam. So in 10 years, we would lose about this number in killed. The British will lose 5,000 more in 24 hours of killed and wounded. These are massive casualties. And in this battle, as you see in the pictures here, will introduce new technologies to the battlefield. For example, some of the very first tanks are employed during the Battle of the Somme. However, like many new inventions, these new technologies, like the tank, they have to learn how to use them, because the British initially try and just send the tanks through without infantry support. And the Germans learn that, hey, if you can get behind the tank, you can take it out. So the tanks really do not turn the tide during this battle. Later battles, when the British and the French and later the Americans learn to use infantry in cooperation with armor, the tanks will have a major effect. But during this battle, they don't. These wonder weapons don't really pay off initially, because this battle will go until November of 1916. So from July 1st, 1916 until November of 1916, you will see the Germans and the British and some French units slugging it out on the River Somme. And the gains the British make are not measured in miles, they're measured in yards. They're measured in yards, like a football game. So less than a football field is the average gain for most British units. And what do we get out of this? Well, at the end of this battle, the collective casualty rate, so killed and wounded for Germans, British, and French, is 600,000 men. 600,000 men in one battle alone. So these are the battles that Americans are reading about in their newspapers. Now, before we talk about America's introduction, let's talk about the trenches, because trench war is one of the defining features of World War I. Because initially, in 1914 and early 1915, World War I was a war of maneuver, as soldiers and units try to get around the flanks of their enemy. They try and outmaneuver their enemy so they can get behind them. The whole point of these battles in World War I are to try and break the line so that you can get into the enemy's rear areas, so that you can get into their supply depots, so that you can take out their artillery, so that you can force their soldiers to retreat. But very quickly, trenches like this are built. Now, these trenches are very crude compared to the ones that both sides have by 1916. Here is an aerial view taken by an early airplane after World War I. As you can see, you have a trench system. Say this is the French trench system, and here you have the German trench system. Let's look at the German trench system since we have more detail of it. You have a frontline trench, and if you notice, it's not straight. It's kind of dragon-toothed. Now, there's a purpose for that, because if you got into this trench as a attacking force, you could just get a machine gun in there and take out everybody down that trench. However, they learned from hard experience, both sides, that if you put these 90-degree turns in there, that if soldiers from the enemy get into, say, this right here, they can't fire straight down the trench and take out everybody along it. They're contained, if you will. You want to contain any breach in your front line so that soldiers from the support trench here can rush through the communication trenches and, well, feed in and destroy the attacking force, the attacking enemy. And then you have a reserve trench for when these troops are exhausted. Because here's how a World War I battle, and when I say battle, I mean, not say the whole battle of the Somme, but a day's battle would go. Troops from the British or the French down here, let me get my pointer to work, they would, on a given signal, you would hear your officers blow a whistle telling everybody along the trench to go over the top and work their way through no man's land. Now, the attacking force would have the support of their artillery firing what is known as a walking barrage, where the barrage would start right here, right in front of your front lines, and walk in front of you, hopefully shielding you from the enemy and also basically bombarding the enemy. The hope is that you can make it across no man's land with your units relatively intact so that you can get into the enemy's front line trench. The problem is, most of these battles, only about 20 to 40% of the soldiers, the attacking soldiers, make it to the enemy's front line trench. These troops are disoriented. Their units are mixed up and confused. They don't know where their officers are at. They're low on ammunition. They're scared. Let's not forget that. Many of them are starting to become shell-shocked because the enemy is dropping artillery on the attacking force, and they have machine guns firing at them. And into this, you have organized reserves in the support trench right here, rushing through these interconnecting trenches, pouring into the trenches, and you have brutal hand-to-hand combat. Usually the attack would fail, regardless of who was mounting it, whether it be the British, the French, or the Germans. And the attacking force would have to find their way in a suicidal retreat back across no man's land, hopefully making it back to their friendly trenches. Now, the purpose of the reserve trench is this, because if your frontline troops and your support troops here have just got done defending your trench system against an enemy assault, they're weakened. But so is the attacking force. The reserve trench is meant so these troops can be funneled through these interconnecting trenches so that as soon as you throw the enemy out of your frontline trench, you can mount an assault of your own and repeat the process all over again, except in reverse. Because look at these trenches. They are well dug in. You have barbed wire and stakes in front of your position. So this is what I was talking about at the Somme. The British hoping that the barbed wire would be cut. This concertina wire, as they call it in military parlance, is basically made to entangle people, to get people all hung up. I mean, have you ever tried to get through a barbed wire fence and you're slipping through and one of them snags you on the back of your shirt? So imagine going through coils of this stuff. It makes you a perfect target for machine guns that are mounted in pillboxes like right here, firing across the trenches. Now, the troops that you are attacking, they've not been taken out by your artillery barrage because of these bunkers right here. Now, these trenches, despite their complexity, despite the bunkers and the reserve trenches and communication trenches, they are a terrible place to serve. They are filled with rats. They're constantly full of water because some of these trenches go through low areas in the French countryside where the soldiers have to bail water like out of a sinking boat because the water line is right at the surface of the ground and they're 6 feet below that. These are areas where you see your friends die, obliterated, turned into a red mist of little bitty chunks and blood by artillery hits. You can also be buried at a moment's notice. If you look closely right here, your video online may not be detailed enough, but you can see right here and right here, these two pieces of metal sticking up out of the ground. These are bayonets. This is at the Battle of the Somme battle site. During the battle, there was a regiment of the French army that was completely buried by an artillery barrage by the Germans. The Germans fired the artillery over, and it was so close to this trench that this regiment was located in, it collapsed the trench so quickly that the men were buried instantaneously, and their rifles that they were holding at the ready for defense didn't even fall to the floor of the trench before they were buried, and they were left sticking up out of the ground. That's how fast you can die, and die brutally, in the trenches of World War I. I can't really put a face to the brutality and the horror of these battles. Now you might be asking, why is it so dark? Well, the reason why it's so dark around this is the French decided that it would be redundant to dig these men up. They died and were buried in the service of France. So after the battle, after the war, this bayonet trench, as it's known, had a mausoleum just built right over it. That's what this concrete wall is. They just basically built the mausoleum over the battle site. There's also another mausoleum in Verdun that kind of shows sort of the futility of World War I. Because in this mausoleum, it's just a big concrete square building. There is a huge pile of human bones. Because after the battle, from the end of the battle to the present day, bones are still working their way to the surface. Skulls, femurs, arm bones. And once they're identified as human remains, there's no way to identify the soldiers. You have men that were blown to pieces. You had men that were buried, as in the case of the bayonet trench. They don't know where they were, who they were. There's no way to identify them, so the only solution is simply to take the bones, to take the remains, and toss them on the bone pile. They are buried with their comrades in this collective, this collective pile. It's almost sad. Now, while Americans are watching this, something happens in 1917. Well, on the one hand, both sides, both sides in Europe are starting to tire of the war. A classic example that shows how exhausted the combatants of World War I had become by 1917 is the fact that in 1917 the French army mutinies. The French High Command, under the sort of tutelage of their commanding general, a fellow by the name of Robert Nivelle, ordered another series of frontal assaults. However, early in 1917, when these orders came down to the frontline units, the soldiers simply said, "We're not going to attack." It doesn't mean that the soldiers left the trenches, because the NCOs, the sergeants and non-commissioned officers, wrote a letter, a collective letter, to their officers, stating that as good defenders of France, they will stay in the trenches and defend against any German attack. However, because they feel that they felt, I should say, let's use the past tense here, because they felt that their comrades, their lives had been spent in, suicidal frontal assaults, they would refuse to attack. Now, at the same time, the Germans are starting to feel the pressure of this blockade. When World War I started, the Germans had a new weapon called the U-boat. Initially, they used it in what is known as unrestricted warfare. The German U-boats would sink any ship flying a British or French flag. This included warships, but also civilian ships, passenger liners, and cargo ships. Taking full advantage of the U-boat's stealth, they would just fire torpedoes into them. Now, the Germans started doing this early on in 1915. However, something happens that I've already mentioned in the previous lecture, and this is the sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania. In May of 1915, a German U-boat sinks RMS Lusitania with great loss of life. Several hundred passengers die, including about 180 Americans who were on board. And the British used this as a propaganda tool because they take pictures of the casualties, the bodies that wash up on the southern coast of Ireland, women, children, babies. And they post these pictures, in not only their newspapers, but they give these pictures to American newspapers to show the barbarous act of the Germans. Now, while this helps start to sway American views of the war, the Germans act immediately. They promise immediately after the attack that they will stop any unrestricted sinkings. Instead, their U-boats will surface next to a ship. They will force it to stop. They will give the crew and passengers time to escape, and then they will sink the ship. Of course, this means that the Germans, the U-boats are incredibly vulnerable, and it sort of gets rid of their one main strength, stealth. But the Germans will do this from 1915 until 1917. Because the Germans want to avoid an American entry at all cost. The Germans had went to great lengths to warn Americans. One of the things that many history books do not tell you is that before the Lusitania sank, or was sunk, I should say, the German consulate in New York ran ads in the New York Times and other New York papers warning Americans not to sail on British ships, and explicitly named the Lusitania, saying that the Lusitania as a British ship was a legitimate target of war. The Germans claim that the British are using passenger liners to transport military goods, like artillery shells. Well, when the passenger liner sunk, the British denied that the ship had any military contraband, any military material on board, that it was only passengers and peaceful cargo. Well, in 1990 to 1995, several expeditions to the Lusitania, using modern technology like ROVs, have went inside the hull of the Lusitania to prove that the Germans were correct, that the ship carried ordnance, it carried weapons of war, which made it a legitimate and legal target for the Germans to sink. Do you think the British are going to say that? As late as World War II, there's evidence that the British tried to destroy the Lusitania wreck. The people who went in the 1990s, what do you call it? Recovery organizations, they pointed out that there were numerous what are known as hedgehog devices lying around the Lusitania, and the Lusitania's hull was perforated in several places. Well, hedgehogs are not World War I weapons. Instead, they are anti-submarine World War II era weapons. These weapons are designed to be fired forward of a ship, sink, and only explode when they contact something. And the salvagers noted that there were hundreds of unexploded hedgehogs lying around the ship, like somebody had went in there trying to destroy whatever was in the ship. But Americans didn't know this in 1915, and German assurances that they would not use unrestricted submarine warfare placates the American government, because even after the sinking of the Lusitania, many Americans don't want to be in this war. Now, why does America get in the war finally? Well, America gets into the war because in 1917 the Germans re-implement unrestricted submarine warfare. They know that they have to break this blockade at any cost, or at least turn the tables on the British by starving them out, by using the U-boats as a blockading force. So Americans traveling on British ships run the risk of being sunk, being killed. Now, the Germans also make a series of mistakes. One of them is known as the Zimmermann telegram. In February of 1917, the German Foreign Office sends a telegram, a coded telegram, to their consulate in Mexico City. The consular down there is a fellow by the name of Arthur Zimmerman. That's why it's called the Zimmerman telegram. It instructs Zimmerman to approach the Mexican government and offer them a deal. The deal is, if the United States enters on the side of the Allies, if the Mexicans will side with the Germans and attack the United States, when the war ends in the Germans' favor, the Germans will force the United States to give back all those territories taken from Mexico in the Mexican-American War of the mid-1840s. So California, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and the westernmost part of Texas. Now, as I said before, the British are reading the Germans' mail. They've broken their military and diplomatic codes. And so the British gleefully give this telegram to the United States government, because this proves that the Germans are the aggressors. Now, let's review. Why does America finally get into this war? Well, unrestricted submarine warfare is re-implemented. The Zimmerman telegram. But let's not forget two crucial facts. The first is that American banks and American business interests are heavily invested by 1917 in an Allied victory. If the Allies lose World War I, or if there is a negotiated peace, they may not get paid back. The only way they can secure repayment is to have the Allies, the British and the French, win. The second is that by 1917, many of America's leaders are pro-British in their sympathies. They're Anglophiles, which means that they are heavily invested culturally, socially, and in terms of their own personal connections with the British. This is nothing new. This has been going on since the late 1800s. So, all of these things combine and cause the U.S. Congress to vote on April 12, 1917 for a declaration of war. And the United States is at war. Now, this doesn't mean that American troops are immediately in combat, because unlike today, the U.S. Army was pathetic. It was pathetic in its preparations and its ability to go and wage a war. The first service that is able to contribute to the Allied war effort is the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy will immediately send a battle squadron to reinforce the Grand Fleet and basically reinforce that blockade that I was just talking about a few slides back. But what about the U.S. military? Well, the U.S. military has to be organized for this modern war. Our military is still organized the same way it was back during the 1870s and 1880s in order to fight Native Americans. The largest military unit that the U.S. Army had at the time were regiments. Just to show you the size of militaries and how they've grown because of World War I, both the French and the British had started out with regiments. Now, what are these military organizations? Well, at the bottom of any military organization, you have let's use the American military for example. You have squads. From squads you have platoons. From platoons you have companies. From companies you have battalions. From battalions you have regiments. That's as far as it went prior to 1914 for the British and the French, and prior to 1917 for the Americans. But during World War I, because of the massive numbers of men involved, the British and the French have to add on to regiments. They have to add corps. They have to add brigades. They have to, they have to add first onto regiments, divisions. Then they have to add brigades, then corps, and then finally entire armies. So when you're talking about the French army in World War I, by 1917 there are actually about 3 or 4 armies in France. Now, the Americans have to adopt this. They have to organize. They have to both physically build their army through recruitment, and finally the draft, but also they have to build the organizational structure and also equip all of these people. And this takes time. Now, the United States will find a competent and actually a very good general in the form of John Blackjack Pershing. Now, Pershing is important for two reasons. First, he's a very competent military general, but he's also a very strong believer that America needs to have its own army, that it doesn't need to be broken up and used as filler for the depleted ranks of the British and the French. And that's exactly what the British and the French want. The British and the French don't want an independent American army in Europe. Instead, they want the Americans to send over platoons and companies to fill in the ranks of their depleted soldiers, their depleted armies. Pershing is against this completely. He tells the French and the British, I'm not going to do it. And the British say, you're going to do it. You know, you are our allies. So Pershing basically sends a letter to Woodrow Wilson, the president, stating that if you agree to the British and the French demanding that our troops be used as cannon fodder for, you know, their troops, I'm going to resign, and I'm going to resign very publicly. Now, Pershing is a popular leader, and Woodrow Wilson cannot afford to have him, resign and, do it very publicly in the newspapers. So he basically tells the British and French governments that there's going to be an independent American army, and if they don't want it, well, we won't come. And so what is created is the first American Army, often called the American Expeditionary Force, or the AEF. Now, the AEF will, let's see here, do I have a map? Nope. Let's go back up here. We'll enter the line about where the Battle of Verdun was, right here. This is where the U.S. forces will be put into the line, here in the French sector. Now, as I said, America enters the war in April of 1917, but it will take almost a year for the first American Army, the AEF, to be organized and be into position. But it's just in time, because in May of 1918, the Germans launch what becomes known as the 1918 Spring Offensive. This is the last gasp, the last gamble for the Germans. Their population is starving. Their army has been depleted by these battles in 1916 and 1917. And so what they do is they take their last reserves, specially train them in new tactics in order to try and break through the line, and launch this spring offensive. And it almost works, because the British and the French are just as depleted. They're just as exhausted. However, the combination of, well, to put it bluntly, German exhaustion, French resolve, and the new American troops at battles like Belleau Wood and the Second Battle of the Marne will stymie this assault. As you can see in this map right here, the Germans make some major penetrations along the French and British sectors, mainly here in the French sectors. But the Americans here keep the Germans from penetrating any farther this way, and in the Second Battle of the Marne are able to help the French actually push this line back. Once the Germans have used up their reserves, used up these specially trained shock troops, they call them stormtroopers. That's where the term stormtroopers come from. They've literally exhausted their last reserves. And so now the Allies can go on the offensive. So the Allies, re-equipped, refreshed, and with the aid of the American army, start penetrating the German line from here all the way back. And so during what becomes known as the Argonne Offensive in the Argonne Forest right here, the American army is not only going to cut its teeth, but also, gain honor, because the Americans prove themselves in combat. American soldiers basically will advance farther and faster than their British and French counterparts during this battle. And of course, Americans will say, this is our contribution to the war. We helped win it. Well, What really won the war was not just the American troops on the ground, but America's manufacturing capacity. Because even before our entry into the war, America is supplying artillery shells, ammunition, guns, clothing, food to the British and the French. Resources that the Germans do not have access to. But when we enter the war, how do we supply our own troops and continue to supply the Allies? Well, you've got to mobilize society. Not only do you have to start drafting young men into the army, you have to fund it. And they do this in several different ways. Two of the most notable ways is new taxes. One of the taxes that is increased, that was pre-existing before our entry into the war, is of course the new income tax. Many critics of the income tax argue that the income tax was passed by Wilson in 1913, rammed through Congress, because Wilson expected a world war and expected the need for, getting America into it. Because an income tax allows the government to tax individuals. It's not based on people's spending. It's not based on how many goods are coming into the country like a tariff is. You basically tax individuals whatever they're doing. However, an income tax can only be raised so far before it becomes ineffective and actually starts to engender hostility. So another way to do this is by selling liberty loans. This is where propaganda comes involved. Because literally the Liberty Loan campaign was selling the war. Just like you were selling stock for a company, the Liberty Loan campaigns were designed to get Americans to buy war bonds so that, these Liberty Loans, later in World War II they were called war bonds, to give the government money to fight the war in the expectation of receiving money plus interest 10, 20 years down the road. Of course, this means that you have to win the war in order for the Liberty Loans to be good. See how this works? Gets people involved, commits them to the war. Another way that the American government will make sure that America will be successful in this war is by getting the government even more closely involved in industry and production. The War Industries Board is created in 1917 to coordinate basically the manufacturing sector of the country, to make sure that certain industries producing essential war material have access to raw materials and labor, while those industries that are producing toys or things that are not related to the war, well, they're lower down on the priority list and they may not have access to those goods. Similarly, the Food Administration will coordinate with farmers to get them to produce more to not only feed American soldiers, but to continue to send food to the Allies. The government will give farmers low-interest loans for the duration of the war so that they can take out loans, buy farm tractors and other necessary items to increase production. Now, when you're drafting large numbers of young men, young white men mainly, how do you keep stuff being produced? How do you keep the factories churning this stuff out? Well, you need a workforce. And one place this workforce comes from is from minorities and from women. In World War I, you see what is often termed the Second Great Migration. These are black Americans who are leaving the poverty and the Jim Crow society of the South and fleeing to the jobs that have opened up in the North. Because, at least for the duration of the war, black Americans can find jobs in factories. Not only can blacks find jobs in factories, but so can women. Find work in jobs that are traditionally not, dominated by women. Women had been in the workforce even before World War I. However, they were in industries like, clothing manufacture or things like that. However, you can see in this picture right here, You see women in light manufacturing. They're making what appears to be, those are, that's actually a Firestone plant. They're making tires. They look like oversized bicycle tires, but remember, Model Ts and those types of cars used very, very thin tires like that. And women enter the workplace. And this entrance of women into the workplace will have an interesting side effect, because many women late in World War I will start to argue that women's contribution in the war justifies their right to vote. Now, one of the key things for any successful war effort is keeping the population behind that war effort. And the Wilson administration will, using several, several key programs, will try and maintain a unified front to keep Americans, in the war. For example, just like you have the War Industries Board to coordinate manufacturing, and the Food Administration to coordinate with agriculture, the Committee on Public Education is set up as basically a propaganda arm of the government. Much of what the CPI produces is very anti-German, and it feeds sort of an anti-German mentality during the war. Now, this is the irony of the war. Remember what we talked about last lecture, back here. Who's the most populous demographic in the country? People of German ancestry. However, during the war, during America's entry in the war in 1917 and 1918, the U.S. government will feed sort of an anti-German furor that goes on in this country. And one of the side effects of this is that American temperance proponents, people who want to prohibit the sale or manufacture of alcohol, will say, we need to ban beer, because beer is a German product. It is. Beer is a product of Bavaria and southern Germany. And so these prohibitionists will argue that, see, if we don't ban alcohol, we're helping the Kaiser. And so it's this argument which will help lead to the passage of the 18th Amendment in December of 1917. So during the war, the 18th Amendment will be passed by Congress, basically making the entire country dry. And they'll be ratified in 1919 and goes into effect in 1920. Now, beyond just an anti-German sentiment, Wilson will get the Congress to pass what is known as the Sedition Act of 1918. Now, many supporters of Wilson paint Wilson out to be a supporter, proponent, if you will, of the little guy, a progressive who's fighting for the common American. I personally don't like Woodrow Wilson because he's not that. He's a racist, but he's also, in my opinion, a control freak. And many critics of Wilson point to the Sedition Act of 1918, because the Sedition Act pretty much nullifies your constitutional rights, and it basically nullified Americans' constitutional rights, or at least it attempted to. The Sedition Act basically says that any criticisms of the U.S. government, the Wilson administration, and the war effort were tantamount to sedition. Sedition is a form of treason, which means that if you were charged with sedition under the Sedition Act, you could not only face imprisonment, you could face capital punishment, the death penalty. So, on the one hand, the government is using organized propaganda. It's churning up anti-German sentiment against a large portion of the American population, and it's basically saying that, if you complain, you're helping the Kaiser. Now, the combination of an American entry into the war and American help to the Allies, combined with the exhaustion of the Germans, finally leads to a negotiated ceasefire. An armistice. That's what a ceasefire is, an armistice. The armistice is agreed to go into effect on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Even back then, diplomats sort of had a style, and so this was very romantic, the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month. Now, November 11th is still, a holiday in this country. It's no longer called Armistice Day anymore, but for, decades after World War I, that's what the United States, the holiday in the U.S. was called. Was called Armistice Day. So, at 11 o'clock at night, on November 11th, 1918, I should say, the guns fall silent. So imagine this kind of eerie experience. You're in the front lines, and you're hearing artillery shell, machine guns in the distance, and all of a sudden, it just quits. It just stops. It's like somebody turned a light switch and it just stopped. Now, even though the fighting stops in November of 1918, the war technically continues until 1919 because the peace treaty that ends World War I will not be signed until 1919. Now, Woodrow Wilson will travel to Europe. Actually, interestingly enough, he'll travel on a U.S. battleship, the USS Nevada, for fear of German U-boats. But he'll travel to Europe to help negotiate this peace treaty, what will become known as the Treaty of Versailles. Now, Wilson, being very idealistic about this war and believing that America's contribution gives him some weight, some clout in the negotiations, comes with 14 points that he wants to have incorporated into the 14 points. So let me tell you what some of these are. The 14 points include open covenants of peace, openly arrived at, no secret treaties, absolute freedom of the seas during peace and in war, the removal of all economic barriers and equality of trade conditions among nations, international disarmament, adjustments of colonial disputes to give weight to the interest of the controlling governments and the colonial population, so the people of the colonies. And then finally, one of the key ones, the 14th point, is what he called a General Association of Nations. This will become known as the League of Nations. Wilson's hope is that this League of Nations could act as a supranational assembly, an assembly of governments above the governments themselves, where instead of going to war, the governments would instead go to the League of Nations and have everybody, all the other nations of the world, help work out any disputes. That is Wilson's agenda. What do you think the British and the French agendas are? They've been fighting since 1914, not 1917. They've lost millions and hundreds of thousands of men. They've broken their national treasuries fighting this war. They don't really give a flying hoot about Wilson's 14 points. The British, led by Lloyd George, that Minister of Munitions I was telling you about, who is now the Prime Minister, and a French politician by the name of Clemenceau, they instead want to put it bluntly, a punitive peace. And they get it, because they've been fighting the war longer, and they can outvote 2-1. They can outvote Wilson. Wilson will get his League of Nations, but the rest of the 14 points are basically thrown onto the scrap heap of history. Instead, the Treaty of Versailles goes this way. Germany will lose all of its colonial possessions. It will be stripped of its military. It will be forbidden from having an air force. It will be forbidden from having a navy. All of those ships that I was telling you about that were here at Wilhelmshaven and Kiel will be forced into basically prison, what amounts to a prison, if you will. They will be forced to go into sort of holding by the British at a place called Scapa Flow, which is right up here, if the map extended that far, which is in northern Scotland. Not only will they be stripped of an air force and a navy, their military, their army, which during World War I had numbered close to 3 to 4 million men, will not be allowed to exceed 100,000. They're stripped of automatic weapons, especially the new submachine guns that stormtroopers use. They will also be stripped of territory. Alsace-Lorraine will go back to France. This area right here will be taken from Germany to help reconstitute a new Poland, thus dividing part of Germany from the rest of Germany. The industrial heart of Germany, the Rhineland right here, while remaining part of Germany, will be demilitarized. That means that the Germans cannot have any military forces in the Rhineland, and immediately after the war, British, French, and some American troops will police the Rhineland. So even though it's still part of Germany, enemy troops will be in the Rhineland, at least from the German point of view. And then finally, the Germans have to accept full responsibility for the war. They caused the war. All the death, all the destruction, everything, they have to take complete ownership of. This is called the War Guilt Clause of the Versailles Treaty. And since the Germans caused this catastrophe, they have to pay reparations to the French and British, because the French and British have a heavy debt from this war, mainly to the United States, and thus they are going to use German reparations to pay off that debt. Now, you need to remember these conditions. If you're the average German, do you think that Germany was the sole guilty party behind this war? Do you think that they should shoulder the burden of, guilt of this war? Should they be stripped of their navy, their army, and their air force that they took pride in? No, especially since when the war ended, no enemy troops were on German soil. If you still looked at the battlefield, it was over here. It was on French soil. Why are we giving up our army when our army is still on the enemy's doorstep? Should we be forced to pay reparations? Well, it's all of these punitive measures which will help give rise to resentment, and this resentment will help fuel fringe parties. And one of those fringe parties that will seize the German imagination in the late 20s and early 1930s are the National Socialist Workers' Party, otherwise known as the Nazis. So what are the lasting effects for America and the world of World War I? Well, you both have a literal and figurative lost generation. If we look at the casualty rates from World War I, let's look at this graph right here. Germany and Austria combined lose 14 million killed or wounded. Out of a population of 64 million people, Germany will lose, killed, over 2 million men. That is 7% of the overall population, but that's a population from children to old people. If you look at the German population of young men, people between the ages of 16 to 40, that 7% jumps up closer to 30 and 40%. It decimates that generation. Britain will lose 1.1 killed in action out of a population of 45 million. Killed and wounded, Britain will lose over 3 million men. That's men that either don't come back or they come back physically or mentally scarred. France, out of 40 million overall population, As you can see, about 6 million killed and wounded. They suffer about 1.5 million killed. And the United States, out of a population of 92 million, we have total casualties of about 365,000, out of which half of that, 117,000, are killed in action. So our losses are relatively mild compared to the other combatants of World War I. Now, it's not just the ones that are killed. You have men who are coming back who are scarred. These are victims of gas that have been either temporarily or permanently blinded on the battlefield. You have men who literally have lost arms and legs or had their faces blown off. Plastic surgery is literally born out of World War I. So every time you see these Hollywood and New York stars who are constantly getting Botox and getting boob jobs and stuff like that, imagine that they are the recipients of, well, an industry that was born out of necessity, not out of vanity. We often think of plastic surgery out of vanity, but it was born out of necessity so that men like this, who has literally had part of his face blown away, could have some semblance of a normal life, so that people would not stare and would not, treat him completely differently. But we also have a figurative lost generation, because those that survive will come back to a society that they no longer recognize, because their societies that they had left, the prior to 1914 societies, these optimistic societies, they're gone. In their place is a pessimistic society, a society that has underwent the rigors of war and came out very much changed. And the soldiers who come back from the war are even more changed. Some of the great writers, like for example the writers of The Hobbit and Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, T.S. Eliot, Tolkien, these are British authors who had fought on the Western Front. They had seen war in its grimmest and most brutal way. And so when they come back, their outlook on life is not optimistic, but instead very dark and pessimistic. The war also will put such a strain on, the civilian populations of not only of Europe, but the rest of the world, that this is one reason why the outbreak of the 1918 Spanish flu has such devastating effects. The flu, which will basically ravage the world between 1918 and 1919, is often credited with about 25 to 30 million more deaths on top of those that had occurred during the war. But because of poor record keeping, it could be even higher than that. Why was the death rate so bad? Well, think about this. You have people in Britain, Germany, France, who have lived on a starvation diet. All of a sudden, a new strain of flu enters their society and decimates it. For the short term, while America economically benefits from the war, the American population is going to look at how the war ends and go, wait a minute, we entered this war to secure democracy, for the 14 points. But instead, we have this punitive peace. We see this is business as usual of one European power beating up another European power. We didn't fight for this, and for this reason, the U.S. Senate, which has to ratify all treaties, will not ratify the Versailles Treaty. Instead, the United States will sign a different treaty with Germany, and the United States government will never join the League of Nations. The League, which was a product of Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. will not be a member of it. We'll be conspicuously absent from the League of Nations. Now, we also see a new Europe. If you look at a map of Europe right here before World War I, you have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire. You have what's left of the Ottoman Empire down here. After the war, here in Eastern Europe, a whole new map is created. Poland reemerges. Poland had existed up until the 1700s, but during the late 1600s, 16 and 1700s, Germany, Austria, and Russia will divide Poland up amongst themselves. You can actually see in darker hues right here where Poland had been. Well, Poland will reemerge. The Czechs and the Slovaks will get a country together. The Austrians, well, their empire falls completely apart, and so the Austrians are stuck in their own little country right here. The Hungarians here, the Romanians, the Bulgarians, and then here, these small little ethnicities, Montenegrins, Croats, Serbs, Bosnians, all of these people who are kind of intermixed, and even if they were in their own little groupings, the countries would be so incredibly small that the people who drew up the Versailles Treaty basically just said, we're going to cram them all together in this country called Yugoslavia. Now, while the American government and the American people will retreat from the world, economically, America will become the world's economic superpower. Because the industries of all of these countries in Europe that were involved are devastated. Germany, its industrial heart is occupied. The British and the French, they've exhausted resources and capital and money. They can't compete with the United States anymore. So after the war, people, instead of looking to the Bank of England and the London stock market for economic guidance, will instead look to Wall Street and the big banks in New York. Now, what are some technical innovations? Well, if you can imagine this, the airplane that Orville and Wilbur Wright flew at Kitty Hawk in the first decade of the 20th century is what the combatants basically use in the first year. But during the course of the war, we see the advent of first biplanes, and then we see things like, well, your first multi-engine bombers. Again, they're biplanes, but they are large, multi-engine planes, not powered kites. Radio, one of my favorite technologies. Before World War I, radio was limited to Morse code. You didn't have voice radio. Now, during the war, early Morse code radio was used by mainly the British and the French, but also the Germans. And during the war, both sides realized that it would be better for, command and control if you could actually speak over it. And so the war will actually give impetus for the development of voice radio. Medicine, plastic surgery, I've already pointed out, was one technological innovation. But battlefield triage, surgery, all of these things, in sort of a perverse quirk of fate, will benefit from the war. So while the war kills millions of people, it does have some benefits. And you can go down the list of, things like cars. Cars get better. In 1914, the car, was the Model T. There was really no such thing as a truck. Most trucks were just Model Ts that had a bed put on the back of them. But after the war, because of the need for heavy hauling, you see the birth of the truck industry. So, World War I does act as a catalyst, but it comes at an incredibly high cost. And many critics of the war also point out that what's to say that these innovations wouldn't have come in their own right? They may have come a little slower, but they would have come. So, next class period, we're going to talk about America between the wars. We're going to talk about American foreign policy. We're going to talk about changes in mass culture, domestic politics, and the fact that America will not find the peace that many Americans hoped the end of World War I would bring. Instead, you see a culture war, if you will. Prohibition, gangs, organized crime, the Red Scare, conflicts between the races, and the rise of the KKK. So we're going to end right now and I will let you hopefully watch this, and hopefully it's not too incredibly boring. If you guys have any questions about this, please write it down so that you will have those questions ready for the next time we meet. Not next Monday, but the Monday after next. Also, as an incentive for you to watch the next video on the 1920s, I will be, during that video, giving you about 4 or 5 movies that you can watch for extra credit. I will talk to you guys later. Have a good spring break, and I will see you in about another week and a half. Bye.